I'm going to show you how to balance your checkbook, and as a result,
you will hear the familiar busy signal.
Life used to be a little more analog and hands-on in the era of the baby boomers. Those who were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s used to have so many skills in the bag because you couldn't navigate through life without them. In many cases, not having these skills would make life unbearable. Here are baby boomer life skills that are now obsolete.
It's the new Kodak 300 color slide projector. Not only is it the smartest looking projector you can buy,
What you're looking at is a slide projector, and no, it wasn't operated by some professional who had training. But operating a slide projector was a skill that was common and was necessary for most people. Those were the days when things were a bit more hands-on and people liked to do things themselves, partly because the technology to do it automatically didn't exist. But the point was that it was a skill that people required to operate in their daily lives. Mastery of the skill allowed you to communicate and engage with the audience visually, and operating a slide projector was only as easy as digging a hole from here to China. It did take some work and attention to detail. First, you had to load the slides correctly into the projector carousel, which was essential for smooth viewing, or they'd be all slanted and scruffy and annoying to watch. The tricky part was adjusting the focus to a certain level of sharpness on the screen. And then finally, you'd have the changing of slides until the presentation was concluded. Beside the basics of operating the slide projector, you also needed to know some troubleshooting techniques. If the projector was faulty and occasionally experienced a jam, or the lighting wasn't properly aligned with the screen, you had to know your way around the problem because your job, workshop, or sales pitch could depend on it. The use of slide projectors wasn't limited to offices and corporate events. It also had personal and social use. Imagine being home with the family, all cuddled up on the sofa, and watching slide projections of the family holidays, a wedding, or any other past documented event. Today's slide projections are completely automatic and easier to figure out, but even at that, it's no longer a skill that you really need.
See, we're redecorating.
Well, for a bedroom, we have this princess phone. Lights in the dark.
Using a landline phone was once a fundamental skill that you just couldn't do without in the old days. Landlines were different from the phones we have today. They were restrictive, meaning that they were connected to wires and cords, and most of them were stationary so you couldn't move around with them, unlike the fancy mobile phones of today that afford you the flexibility. The interesting thing with a landline was that when a call came in, there was no way to know who was calling, so you'd have to learn certain phone etiquette which allowed you to communicate better. And in many cases, the caller probably wasn't your contact, and you had to take down a message for someone else or write down some valuable information on a piece of paper, which was usually stationed near the phone. Receiving a call was no big deal. All you had to do was lift the receiver from the cradle and ensure that you didn't stray past the extension of the cord connecting it to the cradle. However, if you intended to make a call, it was a completely different line of action. Most landline phones were either rotary dial or push button. Rotary was much older, and dialing required you to stick your finger in a button piece and draw an arc, then release it to return it to its position. The numbers sent electrical pulses down the line to dial a unique group of digits, and the push-button dial was much easier, requiring only a push of a button. Landline phones were the only means of communication in the baby boomer days, and sometimes multiple landlines in the same house were connected to the same number. It made communication complex, as other people could listen in on your conversations, and one other thing that made them a bit of a hassle was that you were required to memorize all the phone numbers you needed to call, or at least write them down in a phone book. Today, you keep these numbers in your digital contacts, and you see the identity of every caller, a true testament to how much things have really evolved. If you needed directions today, you'd simply use your GPS, which does all the work for you. However, baby boomers didn't have that luxury. You'd have to go to new places with a foldable paper map stashed away in your pocket or the pigeonhole in your car just in case you got lost. And reading a map was a skill you simply couldn't do without. You had to be well versed with the elements on the map and understand geographic details like symbols that indicated major cities, towns, villages, and more. Road trips were fun with friends because you'd all join in on deconstructing the best way to go. These paper maps were not always accurate because vegetation could grow where it didn't exist before, and construction might be happening where there wasn't any previously. And let's not even get into flooded areas that used to be dry. The point is, reading maps was a very necessary skill that you just couldn't find your way without. Today, these skills are no longer required, and you can get visual and audio directions right from your smartphone. What skills did you need in the 50s and 60s to avoid getting stranded at the bus stop? Keep on watching to find out.
One of the most important reasons why you want to balance your checkbook is to avoid paying fees to the bank or credit union.
In the past, it was normal for people to own books where they wrote down things they bought and their sources of income. This was often arranged by month to understand how money was spent and how it was acquired. If you're wondering what strange behavior this was, it was called balancing the checkbook. This act taught both the young and the old the value of a dollar and how to account for every income. You didn't need to have any form of professional training to be able to balance your checkbook. All you needed was basic literacy and financial intelligence. Financial intelligence wasn't only for a particular type of people, though. Even the rich had to balance their checkbooks and calculate their expenses to better understand spending habits. This critical task was often done to match bank records, and each time you wrote a check, deposited, or withdrew money, you'd write down these transactions. Banking technology was not as sophisticated as it is today, so there were no balance texts or credit and debit texts. You just had to keep up with your finances on your own without the help of a fancy app. The ability to keep track of your finances was a skill that everyone had to have. Overdrafts, error detections, and tracking are easily conducted when you have a written record to compare with. So yes, balancing your checkbook was a basic skill that most people had at the time, and it's one that's missing in today's society. That's why it's easier for people to go bankrupt in an instant without any accountability. Credit cards and debit cards introduced much easier ways to blow through your finances and even acquire debts with just the swipe of a card. Aside from buying ready-made clothes, there was a bit more self-sufficiency when it came to making them. Sewing in those days wasn't left to fashion designers, and not at all, it was a pretty common skill. Sewing and mending clothes was especially popular with women, and almost every home had a sewing machine lodged and set up in the corner. Sewing your own clothing saved you a ton of money, from small patching to fixing buttons, all the way to making a complete dress. And in those days, there was a need to get engaged in one form of skill or another. Computers didn't exist, and neither did digital skills. People had very few occupational options to raise money for their families, so if the government wasn't employing, and private firms weren't either, it was a lot easier to learn to hand trade and offer skills for money. Sewing was a common means of making decent income, and today there are lots of skills to learn if you want a source of cash. Sewing is now a skill that only fashion enthusiasts use. It's still worthwhile to know your way around a sewing machine, at least for repairs and fun fashion upgrades when it's necessary.
The transmission is located right at the bottom of the gear shift lever.
Remember the days when learning how to drive a car was a lot more difficult and therefore was a huge deal when you got that license? That was because most, if not all, cars used a stick shift. Manual car operation is a process that many had to learn if they ever intended to drive or own a vehicle. It was all about manual transmission, and while some vehicles were designed with a 3-on-the-tree shifter, others were equipped with 4 on the floor. Manual driving was like a sitting dance. The harmony between the hands and feet created different levels of speed, and the difference between the stick shift and the automatic transmission that you have today is that vehicles in the past have a clutch pedal to engage and disengage the engine from the transmission. The stick shift sits in the center console and allows you to select the suitable gear. The tachometer displays the RPM and helps the driver know when it's necessary to shift for fuel efficiency and optimal performance. Imagine not knowing how to use a stick in those days. There's a good chance you'd probably ride in the passenger seat for all of eternity.
B. Go. Register.
From the early 19th century to the mid-20th century, computers were not made. Their earliest versions were analog input and storage systems that were used for data processing. These systems mainly involved using punch cards for computing. This process of data analyzing and computing was quite complicated, but was a necessary skill for those who handled payroll, inventory management in offices, and various forms of complex scientific calculations for automation. Using punch cards for the computing process typically involved a specialized system where instructions and manual data were physically represented by multiple holes on stiff cards. In certain settings, you may find a huge stack of meticulously arranged cards with holes that represent data on them. Each card followed and the other card followed the next, so it was important for those cards to remain in their order, without getting shuffled, or it may take forever to get them back into their real order and valuable information could be lost. The skill was mostly desired by professionals in data-related fields, and to express data on the card, holes were punched, with each card having rows and columns that carried several commands and/or characters, with either the presence of holes or their absence. The card readers designed to detect and read stacks of punch cards, and what used to be a very highly sought-after skill, is now completely forgotten because of the obvious technological advancements. Now there are modern hardware and software that can analyze input and store large amounts of data in the blink of an eye with a lot less effort. However, using punch cards for computing will remain a fascinating part of history that will always be remembered.
Turn the TV on. And it's on channel 1 right now. We'll go to channel 3.
In the early days of the baby boomers, switching on the television was a lot more complicated than merely pushing a button. Imagine switching on your TV, and instead of laying back on your sofa to enjoy The Price is Right, you had to crack your fingers and begin a round of electronic tuning while waiting for your desired channel to show up at all or find a better signal to work with. Manual TV tuning required the patience of a baby boomer and a dexterity of a surgeon. The smallest overturn could make a slightly unclear channel into a completely unsalvageable situation. Families would watch with bated breath as the handiest person in the home would fiddle with knobs. And let's not forget about those antennas, which were an essential part of the viewing experience. If your television had the rabbit ear antennas, then you're in luck. You simply fiddle and adjust until you get that clear picture. But if you used a rooftop antenna, you would need assistance to yell clear while you scorched on the roof searching for the reception. Either way, manual television tuning was fun, and certainly a skill that was worth having in the old days.
Daphne's desserts are so original. Look at her pie.
Upside down.
How clever.
In those old days, Mom's cooking was a thing. Traditional cooking skills and recipes bestowed on offspring by their spice-talented mothers were never overlooked. Most families loved and appreciated a well-made home dish, which certainly involved cooking from scratch, as opposed to the microwave chefs of the modern era. Baby boomers took pride in acquiring various types of recipes, trying out dishes and cooking from scratch, all for the sheer love of it. Families shopped for live ingredients and had a daily household routine of labor-intensive cooking that was done over the stove or the oven. The scent of broth, the kneading of dough, the chopping of vegetables, and the mixing of batter was a frequent activity, and the results were a culinary delight with an expansive nutritional value. With hundreds of thousands of eat-out places available today, the art of cooking is slowly leaning toward scarcity, with fewer people who share the values of its art. Using a card catalog in a library was one of the earliest methods of finding the book that you wanted, and long before computers and digital catalogs existed, everything was done by hand, and card catalogs were the innovation of their time. The card catalog mainly consists of many tiny drawers, each containing hundreds of cards. Each of those cards represented a book in the library's collection, which provided important information that you were looking for, such as the author's name, title, subject, and location in the library itself. Cards were mostly arranged in alphabetical order. It was like an indoor treasure hunt where one clue led to another. This skill was required if you were an avid reader or visited the library on a regular basis. Today, we use digital systems, online databases, and search engines, which make it easier to find books and information. Handwriting in the late 40s through the 60s was always an essential skill that started from childhood. Children were taught under the guidance of a teacher to construct alphabets and numbers in the most basic font possible. The emphasis was on penmanship and clarity. Schools would place a huge importance on handwriting as a fundamental means of communication. Since there were no computers or assistive technology, every child had to go through the artistic process of handwriting. Cursive writing was taught as a standard in all curriculum, whether it was Zahner-Blosser method or Palmer, and the act was focused on developing uniform lines and readable scripts. It didn't matter how long the drills went on or how repetitive they got, because it laid the foundation for good handwriting. Long ago, before Uber and probably before fancy transportation systems like bullet trains and others, transport worked like a TV program schedule. You had to know when your favorite program was going to be aired, and you probably had to be seated before it began. In the same way, public transport navigation systems made pamphlets available that had bus and train schedules. The pamphlets listed the times, routes, and pickup stations, along with subways, trams, and trains, and the skill of reading and interpreting these schedules, as well as keeping up with the pickup time, was necessary to get by. It was important to memorize the pickup time, the key stops, and regular routes of certain buses in order not to miss them. Bus riders relied heavily on word of mouth and the personal experiences of others before they became adept at memorizing the schedules and familiarizing themselves with stop points. Asking for directions and guidance on navigation was not uncommon, as service delays and changes in schedule would alter a commuter's plans and leave them stranded. So having a backup plan was always important when in doubt. Asking for directions the polite way was a social skill which provided you with options. The ability to perform a set of mathematical calculations may seem impossible to some without a calculator, but believe it or not, baby boomers did not have the luxury. At least, it wasn't very common. Most times you had to engage in manual calculation. A strong foundation in mathematical principles was necessary to thrive in this era, and it was the backbone of many daily tasks. Students were rigorously trained in all forms of math techniques and were taught to solve complex problems using manual methods. Advanced calculations in finance, engineering, and other fields were done with the use of a slide rule. Understanding the rudiments of manual calculation was a necessary skill, not only for professional fields or education, but also in personal lives, such as creating a budget, balancing a checkbook, doing your taxes, and even running grocery purchases and more. Today, there's little to no need for manual calculation. Smartphones and computers are at the ready for every mathematical task. Which of these life skills did you find most impressive? And are there any that we left out of this list? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you never miss another great memory in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.